David sat frozen at his desk, staring at the red numbers flooding his laptop screen. His heart pounded as he whispered, "This cannot be real." The news of the family business collapsing overnight spread like wildfire, leaving shock and silence in the office. Emily stormed into the room, her voice trembling as she said, "David, the bank just refused our extension." Their father entered slowly, shoulders slumped and face pale, murmuring, "It's all gone, son." The weight of generations pressed on David's chest as he struggled to breathe. Betrayal clawed at his mind. The trusted investor had pulled out without warning. Every decision, every sacrifice seemed meaningless in this moment. The family legacy was crumbling, and for the first time, David feared he might not survive the storm. The morning after the collapse felt like walking through ruins. David sat at the breakfast table, untouched coffee steaming, while Emily read the rejection letter aloud with trembling hands. "They said our debts are too great," she whispered, her voice breaking. Their father stared blankly at the newspaper, headlines screaming of economic turmoil, his pride shattered. David clenched his jaw and muttered, "We worked too hard to be dismissed like this." Silence consumed the room, broken only by the tick of the clock, each second heavier than the last. Fear had become their new reality, and the weight of impending bankruptcy tightened its grip. Later that day, David walked into the family-owned warehouse, the smell of dust and oil mixing with memories of better times. His footsteps echoed as he stared at rows of unused equipment. Emily followed close, whispering, "We can't keep the staff paid." The weight of her words clung to the walls. Richard stood in the corner, his cane tapping against the floor, muttering, "This place built our name, now it's a tomb." David pressed his hand against a rusting machine, whispering, "I promised we'd never lose this." The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant hum of failing lights. Desperation set in as phone calls flooded David's office. One creditor demanded, "You're out of time, David." His face tightened as he pleaded for an extension. Emily sat nearby, scribbling numbers furiously, whispering, "It's impossible to balance this." Richard paced the room, his cane striking the floor angrily. "We trusted the wrong people," he growled, his voice heavy with regret. David closed his eyes, the words echoing like a curse. The phone rang again, and he answered with a shaking voice, only to hear another demand. It felt as if every ring was a hammer striking the coffin of their future. That evening, David returned home, the house once full of warmth now drowned in silence. He dropped his jacket on the chair, staring at the family portraits lining the hallway. Emily followed, her voice breaking as she said, "We may have to sell everything." Their father sat in the living room, staring into the fireplace, though no fire burned. David whispered, "This business was supposed to secure our future." His voice cracked under the weight of failure. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, though her eyes revealed doubt. The narrator explained how even within the safety of home, the shadow of ruin was inescapable, pressing against every wall. David sat alone in his office, head bowed, staring at the stack of unpaid invoices spread across the desk. The silence pressed on him like a weight. Emily entered quietly, placing another rejection letter on the table. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "They don't trust us anymore." David clenched his fists and muttered, "We gave everything to this business." Their father leaned against the wall, his shoulders heavy as he said, "Trust is hard to earn back once it's lost." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The ticking of the clock grew louder, each beat mocking the slow erosion of hope. David pressed his palms against his face, wondering if the burden was too great to carry. The family gathered at the dinner table, plates untouched and cold. Emily lowered her gaze as she whispered, "We need to cut staff." David shook his head, jaw tight, replying, "There are people, they've been loyal for years." Richard stared down at his hands, his voice firm, "Loyalty won't pay the bills." Silence spread, heavier than the storm outside. Rain pounded against the windows, rattling the glass, each strike sounding like the crack of a gavel. David gripped the edge of the table, torn between duty and desperation. Emily's eyes glistened with fear, and Richard's tone lingered, a cruel reminder that survival demanded sacrifice. Morning brought no relief as David entered the bank, the marble floors echoing beneath his shoes. He carried a folder of business plans, desperation etched on his face. Across the desk, the manager folded his arms and shook his head before David could speak. "Your debts are too deep," he said flatly. David leaned forward, voice tight. "We only need time." The refusal was swift, leaving him hollow. Outside the glass doors, Emily waited, her eyes searching his for a shred of hope. He shook his head once, and she understood. Their dreams collapsed one door at a time, each rejection stripping away another piece of their future. Anger replaced despair that night, as David paced the living room, his fists clenched and voice sharp. "We trusted the wrong people, and now we're paying the price." Emily sat on the couch, hands trembling as she muttered, "We can't undo the past." Richard slammed his cane against the floor, his tone cutting through the air. "I told you never to rely on outsiders." The family, once bound together, now cracked under the weight of blame. Shadows from the flickering lamp stretched across the walls like claws. Every word struck deeper than the last, carving into their bond, and leaving silence that burned more than the arguments themselves. Exhaustion settled over them like a heavy shroud as David sat at his desk again, staring at a ledger drowning in red ink. Emily entered quietly, her voice fragile. "We could still sell the property." David shook his head, whispering, "That land is the last piece of our legacy." Richard sat in the armchair, his eyes closing as he muttered, "Legacies don't feed families." Silence followed, thicker than smoke, every breath strained by the weight of impossible choices. Outside, the storm rattled the windows, thunder rolling like judgment from the sky. The night seemed endless, and within its shadows, hope felt like a distant memory slipping further away. David sat in the warehouse office, the glow of a single lamp illuminating stacks of unpaid bills. His hand trembled as he signed another check that would soon bounce. Emily paced behind him, whispering, "We can't keep hiding from this." He replied sharply, "If we cut too deep, we'll have nothing left to rebuild." Richard stood by the dusty window, his cane tapping rhythmically, muttering, "You're already standing on ashes." The words stung, but David forced himself to look at the plans scattered across the desk, sketches of a future that seemed unreachable. The silence that followed pressed on their chests like stone, each breath harder than the last. The next morning, David met with the investor who once promised salvation. Sitting across a polished oak desk, the man smirked, saying, "Business is risk, David. I had to protect my own interests." David leaned forward, voice tight, "You abandoned us when we needed you most." The investor shrugged, adjusting his cufflinks. "That's how the game is played." Rage simmered under David's skin, but he swallowed it, knowing anger would solve nothing. Outside the office window, traffic moved freely while his life stood paralyzed. Emily waited in the lobby, her hands twisting nervously, and when David emerged, she saw the defeat etched across his face. At dusk, the family gathered in the empty warehouse floor, shadows stretching across concrete. Emily broke the silence first, her voice shaking, "We have to tell the staff the truth." David's hands clenched as he answered, "If we do, they'll walk out tomorrow." Richard struck his cane against the ground, declaring, "They deserve honesty, even if it destroys us." The argument rose with the echoes bouncing off metal walls, voices colliding in anger and desperation. David's chest tightened as he glanced at the faded company logo painted high above, now peeling with time. Every word spoken cracked the fragile foundation they stood on. That evening, David sat in the family living room, a single lamp casting circles of light on the wall. Emily sat across from him, eyes tired but resolute. "If we're going to survive, we need outside help," she said. David shook his head, his voice hard. "Every outsider has left us bleeding." Richard exhaled deeply, his tone softer than usual. "Sometimes survival means swallowing your pride." The words hung heavy, colliding with David's stubborn silence. He stared at the portraits on the wall, faces of those who built everything they now risked losing. The air smelled of dust and despair, as though the house itself knew their future was collapsing. Rain hammered the roof as David returned to the warehouse late at night. He walked slowly between idle machines, the metallic smell filling the air. Emily followed, her voice low. "This place is bleeding us dry." David placed his hand on a rusting conveyor, whispering, "This is all we have left." Richard appeared behind them, his voice cutting through the darkness. "It's just a building if there's nothing to put inside it." The three stood in silence, the sound of rain dripping through leaks, echoing like a clock counting down to the end. David's chest ached as he realized they were standing inside the hollow carcass of their dreams. David flipped through old financial records late at night, his eyes narrowing as he spotted inconsistencies buried in the numbers. Emily leaned over his shoulder, whispering, "What is it?" His jaw tightened as he muttered, "These withdrawals weren't for business." Richard stepped closer, his face pale, asking, "Who signed them?" David pointed at the signature at the bottom of the page, the name of the very investor they once trusted. His voice cracked with anger. He siphoned money out months before the collapse. The air turned heavier, as though betrayal itself had entered the room, and Emily covered her mouth in disbelief. Emily slammed her palm against the desk, her voice rising. "He set us up to fail." David's hands shook as he whispered, "We trusted him with everything." Richard lowered himself into a chair, his cane leaning against his knee, his voice bitter. "He was never here for us, only for himself." The sound of rain outside deepened the silence between their words. David looked at the crumbling business plans spread before him, rage and despair fighting for control. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she said softly, "We were betrayed from the start." The truth cut deeper than the losses themselves. The next morning, David stormed into the investor's glass-walled office, slamming the damning documents onto his desk. The man leaned back casually, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Business is business, David," he said coldly. David leaned in, his voice sharp. "You stole from us." The investor adjusted his cufflinks, unbothered, replying, "I secured my position before the ship sank." Rage surged through David's veins, his voice breaking. "You destroyed generations of work." The man's grin widened, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Then rebuild it if you can." David's fists clenched, but he turned away before fury consumed him. Back at the warehouse, David threw the documents onto the table, his voice echoing, "He admits he drained us." Emily gripped the edge of the desk, whispering, "How could we have missed it?" Richard sat silently, his eyes filled with regret, before he muttered, "I saw his ambition, but I thought it meant progress." David paced in fury, his voice trembling. "He profited while we crumbled." The air was thick with anger and guilt, every word driving wedges between them. Emily finally said, her voice breaking, "This wasn't failure, it was sabotage." Their world felt smaller, consumed by the cruel truth. That night, silence filled the family home as thunder rolled outside. David stood by the window staring into the storm, whispering, "He wanted us destroyed." Emily joined him, her voice fragile. "What if he succeeds?" Richard, seated in the corner, closed his eyes and murmured, "Then we fight, or we lose everything." David turned, his face hardened, no longer just desperate, but determined. "If he took from us," he said, "then we'll expose him." Emily met his gaze, fear and resolve blending in her eyes. The storm outside mirrored the one inside their hearts, and for the first time defiance burned against despair. David stood in the warehouse office, fists pressed against the desk as he said, "He destroyed us, but I won't let him win." Emily looked at him with wide eyes, whispering, "You're planning something risky, aren't you?" He nodded, voice steady. "It's the only chance we have left." Richard leaned on his cane, shaking his head. "One gamble nearly ruined us, another might finish the job." David's jaw tightened, defiance burning in his eyes. "We either fight now," he said firmly, "or we lose everything forever." Silence followed, broken only by the creak of the buildings settling around them. The family gathered at the dining table that night, papers spread across its surface like a battlefield. Emily tapped the numbers with a trembling finger, whispering, "This could ruin us if it fails." David leaned closer, eyes sharp, "Or it saves us." Richard exhaled heavily, muttering, "Hope isn't a strategy." David met his gaze, fire sparking in his voice. "Sometimes it's all we have." Emily's lips trembled as she whispered, "I'll stand with you." Richard looked at them both, torn between fear and pride, before nodding once. The decision was made, and the gamble would define their future. The confrontation came in a sleek glass boardroom, the investor seated confidently at the head of the table. David burst in with Emily and Richard at his side, slamming evidence of theft onto the polished surface. "You stole from us," David said coldly. The investor smirked, his voice dripping with arrogance. "And what will you do about it?" Emily's hands shook, but she stood firm, declaring, "We'll expose you." Richard leaned on his cane, his tone steady. "This ends today." The room crackled with tension, every eye locked on the man who had betrayed them. For the first time, fear flickered in his smug grin. The investor leaned back in his chair, sneering, "No one will believe you. I own the narrative." David leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Truth doesn't need your permission." Emily placed a folder of evidence in front of him, her voice shaking but firm. "We've traced every cent." Richard's cane tapped the floor, echoing like a drumbeat as he said, "You've underestimated us for the last time." For a moment, silence hung in the air, the investor's confident mask faltering. David's fists unclenched as he realized the power had shifted. This was no longer a plea, it was a fight for justice. The meeting ended in chaos as the investor stormed out, his arrogance cracking into anger. David stood tall, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths, whispering, "It's not over, but we've shaken him." Emily touched his arm, eyes bright with both fear and hope, saying, "We still have a chance." Richard leaned heavily on his cane, his voice steady. "You showed him we're not broken." Outside, the storm had cleared, sunlight piercing through dark clouds as though reflecting their resolve. For the first time in weeks, the weight on their shoulders lifted, even if only slightly, as they prepared for the battle still ahead. The house was quiet after the storm. David sat at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand, signing away assets to cover debts. Emily stood across from him, her voice soft. "At least this buys us time." He gave a tired nod, murmuring, "Time is all we can ask for now." Richard lowered himself into a chair, staring at the floor as he whispered, "I never thought I'd live to see this legacy sold piece by piece." David's hand paused mid-signature, his eyes burning with shame. Emily reached over, placing her hand gently on his, saying, "We still have each other." The silence that followed was heavy, but less suffocating. Later that morning, David walked through the warehouse floor one last time, the sound of his footsteps echoing across empty concrete. Emily followed quietly, whispering, "This place doesn't define us." He brushed his hand along a rusted machine, replying, "But it built us." Richard leaned on his cane, his eyes scanning the fading company logo high on the wall, saying, "Memories remain, even when the work is gone." David stopped in the center of the floor, his voice cracking, "I never wanted to fail you." Emily shook her head softly, answering, "Failure isn't the end, it's the lesson we carry forward." In the afternoon, creditors gathered around a long wooden table, documents spread out like weapons. David sat at the center, steadying his voice as he explained, "The money was stolen, but we've gathered proof." Emily slid folders across the table, her hands steady though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Richard sat quietly, his presence commanding respect. One creditor leaned back, frowning. "Proof doesn't bring back what's lost," David replied firmly, "but it clears our name." The tension eased slightly as the evidence was reviewed, murmurs filling the room. For the first time, David felt the crushing weight on his chest lighten, even if only a little. That evening, the family returned home, exhaustion etched into their faces, but a faint relief settling in. David sank into the couch, whispering, "We may not have saved the business, but we saved ourselves." Emily sat beside him, nodding. "We fought back, and that matters." Richard lowered himself into his chair, his voice low but steady. "The business was never just the walls. It was us." David leaned back, closing his eyes for the first time without dread, murmuring, "Maybe this is where rebuilding begins." Emily smiled faintly, her shoulders easing, as if a burden had been lifted, if only slightly. Night settled quietly, as David stepped outside onto the porch, the cool air brushing against his face. Emily joined him, her voice gentle. "Do you think we can really start again?" He exhaled, eyes fixed on the dark horizon, saying, "We don't have a choice, we rise or we fade." Richard's voice came from behind them, steady and resolute. "You're stronger than I ever was, don't forget that." David placed an arm around Emily's shoulder, the first hint of hope flickering in his eyes. For the first time, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was the breath of a new beginning. Morning light spilled into the kitchen as David stood at the counter, staring at the last folder of company records. He whispered to himself, "This chapter is over." Emily entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and said, "Endings make space for beginnings." Richard shuffled in, lowering himself into a chair with effort, his voice raspy. "What matters is you're still standing." David nodded, sliding the folder into a box, sealing it shut. The sound echoed like a final nail closing the coffin of the business. Emily reached for his hand, offering a small smile, and for the first time he let himself return it. Later that day, David walked through the abandoned warehouse one last time, footsteps echoing against hollow walls. Emily followed at a distance, whispering, "It feels like saying goodbye to a person." David stopped beneath the faded logo on the wall, running his hand across the peeling paint. He murmured, "This place raised me." Richard's voice came from behind, steady but soft. "And now it's time to let it go." The 3 stood together in the vast emptiness, the silence carrying both grief and acceptance. For David, the warehouse no longer felt like a tomb but a memory etched in steel and concrete. In the evening, the family gathered in the living room, the glow of a fireplace finally lit. David sat forward, hands clasped, saying, "We may have lost the business, but we didn't lose ourselves." Emily leaned against the armrest, replying softly, "We're still a family, and that's what matters." Richard stared into the flames, his voice heavy but proud. "I thought I failed you, but I see strength in you I never had." David exhaled deeply, tension easing from his shoulders. For the first time in months, warmth returned to the room, not just from the fire but from the bond they nearly lost. The next morning, David and Emily stood outside on the porch, the horizon painted with the first rays of dawn. Emily asked, "What comes next?" David placed his hands on the railing, answering quietly, "We rebuild, but not the way we did before." She tilted her head, studying his face, before nodding. "This time, we do it differently." Richard stepped outside, joining them with a slow but steady step, murmuring, "Every ending is a seed for something new." The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of wet earth after a storm. Hope finally felt real, fragile, but alive. That evening, David sat alone in the office, with one final family photograph in his hands. His voice trembled as he whispered, "We almost lost everything, but we didn't lose each other." He placed the picture frame on the desk, the cracked glass reflecting his face. Emily entered quietly, her voice soft. "The scars will remind us where we've been." Richard followed behind, adding firmly, "And I'll remind you never to bow again." David stood, drawing both of them into an embrace. For the first time he felt whole again. The lights dimmed, leaving only the quiet hum of tomorrow waiting.